Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
Good evening, everybody. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Science Cafe here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Thanks for coming out on a Thursday afternoon, evening to join us for our special events. Well, it's sort of special. We do the Science Cafes every Thursday night here at the museum, so you could come every single week and learn something new about what's going on in the world of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, what's going on out there in our community and how it applies to your daily life every week right here on the stage of the Daily Planet Cafe. Speaking of the Daily Planet Cafe, give them a round of applause for helping serve you your food, beverages, drinks, and make sure that if you get hungry or thirsty again while you're here, you go hit them up again. Thanks for coming out tonight, everybody. It's good to see so many people. Anytime we do a topic related to the brain, we can get a pretty good crowd here at the Science Cafe. We should do the brain all the time. Just get big crowds all the time. Why? Because we all have one. I mean, I have some relatives, but okay, I got you on one of them. Right, we've all got one. We all want to know how it works because it's really critical. And we tend to think that our brains are very important to us, right? We sort of should. But it's interesting to see that scientists and technologists, researchers are interested in figuring out how the brain works so that they can make technology work better. Or maybe sometimes the other way around. I was doing a little reading up on sort of these intersections between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. I found this really cool thing online, and I have to show it to you. I have to tell you about it. Not that I can plug stuff, so I'm not going to tell you the name of it, because this is a state organization. But it's this website that's built off of artificial intelligence. You press a button, and it makes motivational posters for social media for you. So these like perfect, square, Instagrammable, motivational phrases and slogans. So here, I did one. It's this gorgeous sunset, and it says, "The big difference between a kiss and a cult is that a cult eats you alive." Yeah, that makes no sense, right? Let's try another one. Let's try it. Artificial intelligence, inspiration. Algorithms can radically alter the way you see problems. Algorithms can radically alter the way you see problems. Is that inspiring anyone? Are you inspired? Right, so here's one thing that a human brain can do better, right? Relate, emotion, empathy. So they've got some work to do on that one right there. And our special guest tonight is someone working at this, well, I think it's fun, but very interesting intersection of artificial intelligence and the human brain. He's from the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, which is doing incredible work. If you've been coming to the cafes regularly for the last few months, we've had several speakers come out from Duke, and they've all been incredible, doing work across lots of different disciplines, but thinking about what's going on in our thinkers. Tonight's guest is Dr. John Pearson. Put your hands together and welcome to the cafe. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Chris. Let the record show I did bring a jacket. I'm a proper professional, but we're all going to be friends here, so I'm in shirt sleeves. So if you look up on the screen, this is the original title of my talk that I sent. So the inspiration for this talk, I have a 2-year-old at home. As far as she knows, Daddy's going to talk about her tonight. And in some sense, that's what I'm going to do. So I have a colleague at Duke. He has been a neurobiologist for many, many years, and he told me before we had our child that he said, the thing that being a parent is going to do, if you weren't already, is make you a developmental neuroscientist, because you're going to see these things happen, and you can't help but be curious about how they happen and why. So in my day job, I spend a lot of time thinking about the things on the left. So this is a human brain. It's a biological brain. It's the wetware that lets us do what we want to do. And on the right is a sort of artist's rendition of these artificial brains, these things that we put in self-driving cars, or chess-playing robots, or just the robots that manufacture the cars, any of those things. We spend a lot of time in my lab, instead of moving from the right to the left on the screen, we move from the right to the left. So that is, we look at things that are happening right now in artificial intelligence, and we say, can these really simplified systems, where we understand every connection, We understand the algorithms that are being used. Can they teach us a little bit, in principle, about how our actual brains work? Historically, we have gone from the left to the right. So how many of you guys have actually heard this phrase, deep learning? There's a lot of hype around this now. This is what Google and Facebook are using to do a lot of the things I'll talk about today. That really started as a revolution about 10 years ago now. Neural networks came about in the late 80s. They were very big fashion for about 10 years and then completely fell off the map. And in the last 10 years, they've come raging back. And I can talk a little bit in Q&A about why that's been and why we're excited about it. But there's a lot of energy in neuroscience right now in asking what can we learn in these very simplified systems about the way our actual brains work. So it's a really good time to be working on artificial intelligence. There are a few pictures up here. So one is this very famous Go master being really soundly defeated by an artificial player from a company called DeepMind, which is owned by Google. There's a self-driving car up there. It's not been a great couple of weeks for these companies in the news, but nonetheless, we're much further than anybody thought we would be 10 years ago. And then there's this really famous story from about 6 years ago where Target was able to figure out that a woman was pregnant before her father did because it was able to cross-reference her purchases. And creepy or not, you have to admit that's pretty impressive. So I'm putting aside a little bit for the purposes of my allotted 20 minutes how creeped out you should be by any of this. We can talk about that during Q&A. I think those are important questions. My wife is an ethicist. So we may or may not talk about that at home. But it's a golden age of AI. It's really impressive to go to the conferences and see the things that people are applying these to, and just year after year after year are able to beat benchmarks on these tasks that people thought were just not possible. Now, the flip side of that is this is the Terminator. Terminator is created by an artificial intelligence called Skynet. I hope I'm telling people things they already know. This is basic culture. But there's a lot of worry. In fact, one of the blogs I ran across today that talks about AI is called Skynet Daily. So I think a lot of people are worried that we're just around the corner from turning one of these things on, and all of a sudden, and people like Elon Musk are up saying this, that we're, a few short years away from the artificial intelligence that will begin trying to kill us all. So I want to give you some hope tonight on that front, and the hope comes in the form of these little kids. Toddlers are our future in more ways than one. The toddlers are still smarter than the artificial intelligences, and I want to talk to you tonight about 3 reasons why. 3 things that artificial machines, artificial intelligences really fail pretty terribly at that even very small humans are extremely good at. And this is really interesting to people who are pure AI engineers who are trying to build better products, but it's really interesting to those of us who study the brain because this teaches us things about how the brain organizes computation and cognition that are important for our thinking about the limits and the organization of neural computation. All right, so these are the 3 things today. So 3 things that humans still do much better. One thing that we do much better is abstract from data. And I'll talk about what that means, and I'll talk about how that fares in practice. But suffice it to say, if I give you a bunch of data to experience in your daily life or just a bunch of stuff to study, you are going to do a much better job of drawing rules and inferences from that per amount of time that you study than a computer does. We'll talk about why that is. The second thing that humans do really well is learn to learn. And this is a really hot topic in like the last 2 years in artificial intelligence circles, is how do you train these machines how to learn new things once you've trained them to do the first thing. And then the third thing is really sort of greenfield for people who are working in industry, but it's something that my colleagues in cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology think a lot, which is how we model other minds. What it is about human beings that makes us not only incredibly social, but incredibly good at doing the sort of inferences that interacting in groups requires. So 3 things. So the first one, abstracting from data. So this plot is a little bit hard to read, but all I want you to take into account is that the bars from left to right in the first panel are going up. This is top 1 performance on the ImageNet challenge. And if that doesn't mean anything to you in your daily life, it just means this. ImageNet is a database of about 14 million images. They pare that down to, I think, a couple million of the top 10,000 most common image categories plus 90 dog breeds for various reasons, because it's really, really important for our computers to know our dog breeds apart. And what they do is they simply say, we're going to give one of these images to a neural network, and we want it to predict the top 5 things it could be. So all you're seeing in that graph is performance at guessing the top 1 correctly. And over there on the right, these are the most recent examples as of, I think, a year ago, is about 80%. So the networks are about 80% good at guessing out of 10,000 categories what the image is. That is incredible performance given that, 10 years ago we were down about 20%, which was still impressive for 10,000 categories, but maybe not anything to write home about. Out of 10,000, you and I might be 90% or 95%, right? There are going to be some objects I just don't know, or I might get confused. On the right is another chart that now I see at this distance is a little hard to read, but as you go from left to right, you're looking at more and more parameters in these models, and as you go up, you're looking at performance. So this is over time. The models are getting better and better, but they're also getting bigger and bigger. So the model that I think is ResNet 150, fun, catchy name, the model that's ResNet 150 there is about 50 million or 100 million parameters. Those are individual numbers that you can think of as dials on the machine that we tune in a fairly elegant way. It takes several days to train. And when you're all done, your 150 million parameters are in some configuration that you can feed it a photo of a Pekingese, and it's going to tell you that's what it is. So this is considered one of the benchmark challenges in image recognition. So this is, in some cases, better than human performance. It's a really signal achievement of this area of study. Yet, my daughter can tell you this is a mouse. And what's really impressive about this is that she has never seen a real mouse. Her exposure to mice consists primarily of Mickey and Minnie and this little book about a mouse that's written in Spanish that we've given her. Those are pretty much her only training examples of mice, and yet in a fairly small number of presentations from a fairly small number of unique images, she has managed to figure out that the thing on the left is an exemplar of that category. There is no algorithm that can do that yet. And there are reasons for that. But even more impressive than this, she's doing all this with a brain that burns about as much energy as this 20-watt bulb, right? So our brains are incredibly energy efficient. If you run a GPU, a graphical processing unit, which were originally built as add-in cards to computers to play video games, and that's why they were developed, and then we figured out we could use them to train neural networks, and then people figured out you could use them to mine Bitcoin, and now they're twice as expensive as they were before. So the video gamers are the people who really lose in this. Our brain runs at a fraction of the energy that these systems run at for much longer periods of time on much more available energy sources. So lots and lots of people are interested in how to just do these things in a more energy efficient way. The more important bit of this is, if you look at this chart of butterflies, it's entirely within the capacity of most people to learn, those 90 breeds of dogs, if they really care about the subject, or to learn a couple hundred breeds of butterfly. That's entirely possible and can be done, again, in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the number of examples. So what does the computer do? So the computer does something like this, and you kind of need to read this thing from left to right. So the boxes at the top are just ways that we think about the schematics of these networks. So there is what we call an input layer, and all that is we feed a bunch of numbers that are the image. We multiply them by a bunch of numbers. We chop them off if they're negative, then we multiply them by a bunch of things again, and we chop them off if they're negative. It's really no more complicated than that. We have some clever ways to train them, and there's a sort of alchemy in how many of these layers you use and how you put them together and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, what you can do is you can look at the functions that every one of these little fake neurons represents in the model and ask, what is it sensitive to? And the really interesting thing for people when they started looking at this, I'd say 7 or 8 years ago, was that at that first layer in the lower left, so at this layer right here, what you really get are bands of colors and edges, which is pretty much exactly what the first layer of your visual system is sensitive to. So without any sort of information about the natural statistics of what's available in the world, without any pre-training, the network learns that a good thing to do, first of all, is determine where the edges are in the world and determine where the color contrast is. So it's a really exciting thing to people that this ended up looking like what our visual systems do, what the visual systems of most animals that can see color do. The second layer there is something that looks like contour and texture. So the system actually starts learning to pull out textures, and then you get things that are a little bit weird to interpret, they're a little bit trippy, but they start to look a little more like objects. And then at the final layer over on the far right, you get things that are kind of highly distorted psychedelic object representations. Now, what's important about these networks is that they only move in one direction, so we only feed information through them in one way, and that all they're allowed to do is very simple multiplications, and that you throw away the negative part. So they're meant to be very simple models, and yet they discover the structure. And there's work out of several neuroscience labs, Jim DiCarlo at MIT and other people, who've shown that the structure that we find when we train these models roughly, and there are a lot of caveats to that, recapitulates what we see in the human visual system. So we've managed to discover some things by accident which are probably not a function of our particular biology, but are more dictated by the computational problem our brains are trying to solve. In other words, this may not be a property of the specific way we solve the problem, that is whether it's in a biological brain or an artificial brain, but inherent in the structure of the problem itself. That's the kind of thing that in my lab we're really excited about, because it says, if I learn something in one of these artificial systems, under what conditions do I actually learn something about the way the brain has to work? Because this is just an efficient way to do it. So that's what these artificial systems do. Well, what is it that we do that makes us so much better? Well, so I'm going to give you a version of the same task earlier. So here what you're seeing is a brain from the bottom view. So the light is kind of going up like this, and there's a little tiny area that's highlighted in red there. This is what's called the fusiform face area. So if you come in to do a study with one of my colleagues at the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and you get in an MRI machine, and they have you do a study and they show you a bunch of faces, and particularly they will often show you a bunch of houses. So faces and houses is a classic contrast. This is the area that will be activated, differentially activated, more active in terms of blood flow if I show you a face. So I'm not saying this area is only involved in face processing, but this is an area that seems to have more activity in response to faces. There's a lot of evidence from other systems, primarily in monkeys, that there are these patches in the cortex of your brain, not too far from where this is, that are 90% cells sensitive to other monkey faces. Monkeys like us are social species. It's really, really important to be able to tell a fear grimace from a threat, which looks like that. Monkeys threat yawn and they fear grimace, so it's not quite the same as with humans. It's really important to tell these differences, because if someone outranks you in the hierarchy and they're angry with you, that is a very important thing to know in your life if you want to survive till tomorrow. So what seems to have happened is that there are these specialized representations where we don't use the same general purpose network to do all tasks in the same way, but we learn to specialize a little bit, and I'll talk more about that later. So for instance, you know, my daughter knows what mommy and daddy look like, and you can attest that it's an accurate representation. So she knows what we look like, and that's not too hard to confuse her on, but the reality is if she met you a couple of times, even if she didn't remember your name, she's likely to remember your face. And that happens because we have this specialized architecture for learning faces and for keeping track of individuals. The other really fascinating thing that's been a big area of interest in artificial intelligence in the last few years is because of this sort of nip and tuck approach to these classification algorithms. That is, I'm going to feed in a bunch of data, and then I'm just going to multiply a little here and add a little here and subtract a little here. They turn out to be really easy to fool. So on the left, you see an image, and I hope you will all agree with me that's a panda. And you see in the middle that there's a bunch of colored splotches. That is noise. That is the colored equivalent of white noise. And we add that to the panda, and the system, I'm forgetting what it actually says, but it says it's an aardvark or a speaker or something like that. Gibbon. So I hope that you can tell pandas and gibbons apart. Neural network cannot. And so these so-called adversarial examples are really interesting, both from the standpoint of they show the networks can be really, really fragile in a way that humans aren't. You can add this noise. You cannot tell the difference between those two panda pictures with your naked eye. I can't, but the network can, and that causes it to guess incorrectly. You can imagine this is problematic if someone wants to unlock your iPhone and they know the right example to put in, or they want to fool a self-driving car. So there's a lot of interest in the information security side, but what it points out to those of us who are brain researchers is that these networks are not robust in the way that humans are robust. So the point I want to make with this is the phylogenetic tree, right? This is all the species kind of organized into this giant tree structure. So you have the kingdoms and the phyla, and you have mammals and placentals above them, and you have this hierarchical way of representing knowledge, right? This is a thing we humans do naturally. It is not a thing that neural networks do naturally. So if you or I mistake one breed of dog for another, we know nonetheless that those are dogs. And we might be able to differentiate certain kinds of dogs from certain other kinds of dogs, even if we don't know the particular breed. The network pretty much gets it wrong or gets it right. There's not a lot of in between in a lot of cases. And the things that it tends to rank on may be more like shape or texture than whether it looks like a dog or a fuzzy radiator. And that's an important distinction, because we not only have this hierarchical knowledge, we have explicit knowledge. So if I'm learning a new field, if I'm learning, if I'm really interested in watching a new TV series, someone said The Wire once had something like 600 characters that you had to know by the end of it to keep up with. And it's very easy to kind of organize those in your head. We're very good at that. But so far, most of the networks don't come built in with a plan to generate this sort of organization of behavior. This kind of knowledge ontology is the key word, was really big in AI in the 80s. That fell out of favor. And I think what we've come to in the last few years is a realization that we want to get back to something like that again. It was very hard to build it in by hand. People made entire careers out of trying to build these by hand. It just doesn't scale. But we realize this is something that's lacking, that humans do very, very readily. All right, so I want to talk about learning to learn. So the term of art for this is meta-learning. And the idea behind this is the following. It is now pretty straightforward. You can download from Google actual trained models that will do things like tell you that's a picture of a dog. Google Translate is now powered by a neural network. It got markedly better about a year ago, dramatically better. So I use the English to French pretty regularly with a friend of mine, and that isn't always correct, but it's much better than it used to be. And they'll do things like play Pac-Man. Those networks are now pretty much standard to train. I could teach a good high school student how to do that. But if you train a network to do one of these things, it will not come close to doing any of the others. And by the time you train it to do one of the others, it will have forgotten how to do the first thing it did. So this is now a major challenge. So the unlearning problem is very central in thinking about actual brains. How do we manage to sort of lock in something we already know how to do, but learn something new at the same time? And what's more important is how are our brains organized in a way that we are optimized to keep learning new things and to put them into categories and understand one thing is like another. So let me give you an example. The thing on the left is a cutting edge. This is out of some work out of Stanford and OpenAI out of Peter Abeel's group. This is Chelsea Finn's work. The idea is that this robot, after only a single demonstration, is able to put a ball in a bowl. Pause for oohs and ahs of surprise. This is a really hard thing to do because it's actually only ever seen one demonstration. So we call this one-shot learning. On the other hand, here's a little girl doing this fairly complicated yoga pose, right, with her mother, yoga teacher, or whatever. And you can pretty much get a toddler, right, to play Simon Says. It's not hard to do. You get them to touch their nose, touch their head, touch their tummy, and they all do that pretty readily, right? That's not a hard thing to do, single demonstration. The difficult thing is that the robot has to sort of learn everything at one go. The human, on the other hand, spends most of the first year just learning to get up on its feet and do an important balancing act. And that, in fact, is the key here. So this is, I think her name is Leah Flynn. She's a little adorable violinist on YouTube. So she plays the violin very well. It's not hard to believe that she could pick up the viola if she worked at it, a little bit. Or the cello because it's a string instrument, or even a dulcimer because it's still a string instrument, but probably by the time she's done those and done this a few times, or if you're a language learner and you speak more than one additional language, you're going to learn some techniques. And so if she wanted to pick up the trumpet or the drums, it stands to reason that you learn those patterns. That is, by the time she's learned 2 or 3 of these instruments, she's developed a higher order representation of the kinds of things that she needs to learn, the sorts of parameters that she needs to fit in order to learn something new. So we think of this in terms of saying, instead of 10 million parameters, maybe what I've got is I've got a really good model. I know most instruments work like this. Languages have nouns and verbs. And so what I really just need to do is figure out, is the order in my new language subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb? And once I know that, I just sort of extrapolate. So that's the kind of learning we're talking about. And yet, because our artificial agents have not had these sort of rich models, they can't be very opinionated. They learn everything from scratch all the time, and everything is being learned all the time. And we know from the brain that that's not actually what happens with synapses. Synapses in your brain tend to be fairly stable over long periods of time, They do grow and decay all the time, but somehow, even though your synapses turn over every few days, your brain manages to maintain stable behavior over years. And that's a mystery that no one has really unlocked yet, but lots of people are thinking critically about. This is another key. This is work out of Josh Tenenbaum's lab at MIT. If you guys look, these are just a bunch of blocks that are stacked. So again, this is pretty basic. Toddlers can do this. What's really interesting is they generate these artificially. And what probably pops out to you, some of you are a little uncomfortable looking at these blocks because it's pretty obvious that about half these configurations are just about to topple over. You don't need to know anything about what the blocks are made of. They're virtual, but you know that. Like, you have this, and lots of work out of Tenenbaum Lab and other places has gone into showing this. You have this intuitive physics engine. You understand that if I drop this, it will fall, it will not float. Very young babies understand what we call object permanency, the idea that if I drop an object behind a screen, it's going to come through the other end, and it's going to be the same object. If I drop an apple behind, it's not going to come out an orange. You learn these rules about the way the world works, so you can walk around, right? So you can deal with gravity. And it turns out that that intuitive physics engine is probably something you lock in pretty early in life, and barring some kind of injury or something else that you have to rehabilitate, stays constant for most of the rest of your life, and you just use as a building block. People are only starting to do this with these artificial agents. And even then, there's some fine-tuning that's involved. So this idea of subsystems or submodules is, again, a thing that we have not, I think, people in industry are still trying to figure out how to leverage. And we understand that areas of the brain can be specialized for these, but they also do a lot of intercommunication. And that's something that is still very incompletely understood. All right, so the last bit as I'm coming around the home stretch, I want to talk about modeling other minds. And this is particularly interesting to me. I spent a lot of my training thinking about social behavior in monkeys, and this is something that monkeys like us tend to do really well. It's very important to them. So I wanted to start off with this. So again, my 2-year-old is getting to the point where she tells jokes, we'll call them that loosely, which largely consists of doing something non sequitur and then laughing. But even in order to do that, one of the things that she has to appreciate is that I am capable of in some way getting the joke. That there's some form of communication that is going on between the two of us that allows her to have an expectation that is violated that then she can laugh about, and maybe I laugh too because it doesn't make any sense. On the right are some machine-generated jokes, my favorite of which is the last one that says, why can't Dracula be true? Because there are too many cheetahs. This is my stand-up debut, by the way, also. I make no apologies for my material. These were generated by an algorithm that was just fed a bunch of jokes, and this is what it spat out. So a lot of them don't make any sense. A lot of them kind of work. They're not anything you would, send to your friend. But this is about as well as computers do, and part of the thing is that humor is elusive, right? Humor is one of those things that depends a lot on who you're talking to, what the context is, and most of all, what you think the other person's expectations are, right? Classic punchlines are reversals of someone else's expectations. You set something up, and then you violate that expectation, which is maybe the lamest description of humor ever. But we are an intrinsically social species. People magazine sells a lot of copies in my supermarket, as it probably does in yours, despite the fact that I will never meet these people. They are people, yes, but they have no impact on my life, and yet I really want to know what they're doing, right? It's really important to me what Kim Kardashian is doing this week. We play these games like poker that are essentially games about probability and chance on the one hand, but are calibrated by our expectations of what other people know, and in particular, what other people think that we know. So we're not only doing sort of one level of mentalizing, that is, we not only have a representation of other people's beliefs, but for really sophisticated players, about their beliefs about my beliefs. And that is something that our algorithms are very, very far from, even though people sort of understand some of this is going to be necessary. And the last picture I have up there, right, we are continually mesmerized by these individuals who do things that fall so far outside the bounds of human behavior that we are morbidly curious about it, because there is very little insight that our own experiences and our own mental models have as to what would make people do some of these things. Now, there's a lot of really fascinating work on this, and I'm going to cut it a little bit short. I'm happy to talk about it during Q&A, but I want to talk about two things. So the first one is from Simon Baron-Cohen's lab. This is a diagram from one of their papers called the Sally-Ann task. This is great. Kids somewhere between the ages of 3 and 4 go from getting this task wrong almost 100% of the time to right almost 100% of the time. So the idea is you have two dolls. You have Sally and Ann. And Sally comes in, and Sally hides the marble in the basket, and then Sally leaves. And the experimenter takes the marble out of the basket and puts it in the box. And then Ann comes in, and moves it. And then Sally comes back in, and the experimenter asks the 3-year-old, where will Sally look for the marble? And the test is able to understand that Sally has a different set of beliefs, has different knowledge than what the 3-year-old herself has. Because the 3-year-old knows the marble is in the box. The 3-year-old may or may not be able to conceive that Sally thinks the marble is still in the basket. So at 3 years old, most kids get this wrong, and at 4 years old, most kids get this right. And they do various checks on this to ask them where was the marble at the beginning, various control conditions. There are adorable videos on YouTube you should look up of this, of actual kids doing this. They're very sincere, but it's very hard for them to sort of understand what false belief is. No primate that we know really clearly and successfully passes a false belief test. There's some debate about it, so I shouldn't take a position. But this is something that humans learn to do very early. We do it really well. On the right is some data from Rebecca Saxe and other people. She's the one sort of most famous for doing this. There's an area called the temporal parietal junction that tends to be very active when we are mentalizing about other people. So if I am asked about a false belief you might have, if I am asked to play against you in a poker game, if I am asked to think about making a criminal decision about you. This is an area, along with a couple of other areas along the midline of the cortex, that seem to be active in this sort of social network. Now, I'm not claiming this is the only thing these areas do. This is always the problem with the brain, everything. But there is some evidence that for social phenomena, these GPUs I talked about, these specialized cards that we put in our computers just to handle graphics processing, is a little bit of the strategy the brain uses. So on the left is this. All the GPU does is make sure that video is being displayed to your screen. On the right is the CPU, and it handles everything else. It's for general purpose computation. And one of the things that we have learned over the history of neuroscience is that to some degree, but not nearly as sharply, that GPU model is how we get so good at what we do. And over a lot of development, we get really, really good at making social judgments. People's ability to read tone of voice, how you look around your eyes, the way you hold your body, those things are all very good and all very rapid because they're very necessary for us to live in groups without all killing each other. It's a worthwhile thing to learn about. On the other hand, a lot of our more abstract reasoning is good enough to get by. And there are even some neuroscientists who would argue to you that our ability to do things like reason about hierarchies, do transitive inference if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, comes from trying to figure out if like Joe is dominant to Bob and Sally is dominant to Joe, and figure this out. Because they would argue that was the original genesis of those things, is that group living was the impetus behind it. So those are all ideas. They're very much under debate. But let me just summarize briefly before we take some questions. So I said, how are we still beating the machines? And we do that in 3 ways. So we are really good at structuring knowledge. We have explicit knowledge, and we do all these tricks to make sure that it's not just a bag of facts, but we organize it in some way. And that's something the current generation of artificial intelligence models is still working to incorporate. We build models and simulate. So not only am I able to sort of grab from these things like hierarchies and collections and analogies, I'm able to build new things, right? And if you've ever studied math, you're capable of learning these totally new abstract concepts that can become second nature. And I'm capable of doing simulations. And that can be physical simulations, like realizing that if I take 3 or 4 steps forward and I'm not watching, I'll fall right off the stage. But there are also things like understanding how other people are likely to react to words that I might say or gestures that I might make. We simulate those things in our minds, and we're capable of taking actions based on those. And the last thing is that we specialize. Our brains don't do everything equally well. There are lots and lots of things like playing Go that the machines are routinely going to beat us at. On the other hand, we have a huge head start on some of these other things that are very important for us as individuals that our brain has just decided, like, I need to be really good at this. Other animals specialize in other ways. Bats are a fascinating species for this reason, being able to navigate in 3 dimensions as opposed to 2. But those are sort of general strategies that I think people in the AI community appreciate our challenges. They're very actively working toward. I can talk a little bit about that. But they're also challenges for us in neuroscience to figure out how the brain actually supports the kind of learning that these things hint at. So I'll say thanks. That's my lab web address. The website is a little out of date, but you can look and see more about what we do. And I'm happy to take questions.
Let's give him a round of applause. All right. I guarantee most of you have questions. So the way it works is I'll have a mic and then Katie will have a mic. We'll go around, move around the floor, bringing mics to you. So wave us down if you've got a question. And I'm going to start in the back.
I have a couple of questions. So in the neural network system, you use a filtration system, right? So you have to apply the filter. Now, in the learning process in the neural network, how an AI decide what filter is good? The second, and then deciding the firing system in the network. The second, in humans, we do 90% in autopilot. So once you learn, you're not going to relearn. How the AI managing that?
So those are really interesting questions. So the first one sort of says, how do we learn what information to throw away when we're training these systems? Some of that is done in picking the architecture. So these little mathematical units that we have in the input layer tend to get smaller. So we try to get the network to make smaller and smaller representations, more and more parsimonious representations of what it's learning. So we make some of those decisions before we ever train the network. The other thing is the network itself is capable of learning to keep. So in the image cases, what we're generally learning are filters. So if you've ever done any image editing, you have a blur filter. We program in something that's more generic than that. So it's capable of essentially learning what type of information. So those edges come naturally out of the training algorithm. So some things we can learn, and you can always try to make a bigger network that learns more things. And what the theory tells you is there's a trade-off between essentially the number of parameters you have and how well you can fit the data you train on, and then how well you do on data you've never seen before. And those two things are always in tension. So the second thing was about, remind me?
Autopilot.
Yes. This is a really interesting question because what people have gotten, a lot of the emphasis and excitement in AI in the last couple of years is in building agents, so that do what we call reinforcement learning. So this is, how do I learn to do stuff in the world if there's no right and wrong answer, but I'm just getting rewards? And that turns out to be a remarkably difficult problem. They have improved somewhat over what probably state of the art was in the early 90s, and they're working desperately hard, but we have not had anywhere near the successes with that. And part of the reason is because what you have to do is, if your agent needs to react very quickly, then you need to slice time very thinly. And unfortunately, what that means is you have to do that everywhere through. So there are some ideas, and a lot of this work has been done in cognitive neuroscience on what's called hierarchical reinforcement learning. So the idea that if I'm going to make a sandwich, I just sort of activate and make a sandwich, and then there's a series of steps that go there, and I'm going to do them in the same way. And so gradually what I learned to do are make these higher and higher level abstractions, like drive to work. And if I don't see anything that's out of the ordinary, I just kind of do drive to work, and then the brain is on autopilot. But for the AI stuff, that's a very unsolved problem, because those models tend to be finicky to make work. And so it's an engineering challenge, and I think there's some really interesting, we did a paper in a journal club a few weeks ago that I think has interesting implications for this, but people are sort of really interested in how you segment memories the same way, right? So you don't remember everything equally, you tend to have these sort of landmarks in memory that you carry with you, and that process is also something people are interested in, but I don't think is a solved problem at all.
I was wondering, based on where humans versus machines excel, where do you think that, how do you think jobs in the workforce is going to change probably over the next 10 to 20 years?
Oh, wow. For the most part, right, things that are, so in general what these algorithms need to work is they need really clean data, and they need a lot of it. So this is, in some ways, there's a debate going on in machine learning about whether neural networks are really better algorithms or they just are bigger models, and whether they didn't work well in the 80s just because we didn't have enough data. So the places they have worked really well and the places where they are likely to eliminate jobs are places that have lots and lots of data so you can train a model. The places they don't work well are all of these things that, you know, there's a reason they have you fill out CAPTCHAs, you know, these like type these 5 numbers into a box. Like they can break CAPTCHAs, but that's actually a hard problem. So anything that involves interacting with another human is very hard to automate right now. Speech to text is getting better. For those of you guys who've done any texting with Siri or whatever, like that's getting better, but it's still considered, you know, far from where people want it to be. What are the other areas that are considered super hard? Language translation is still one where I cheated a little bit. French to English is the best because the training corpus is all Canadian government documents because they're all bilingual. You know, if you talk to any of your Chinese friends, like, you know, it's a different story. So it's hard to say, and I don't have a great crystal ball, but in general, where we have lots of data, and in particular, where we have lots of labels, that's the other limit. So to train with these image systems, you need to know what the category is, and the way we do that now is we pay people on Amazon, you know, like a few pennies an image to label images. And a lot of the bottleneck right now is in the fact that the training sets can't get much bigger without actually paying people to annotate them. And so it's understood that's unsustainable. Things in vision are really good. Things in audio, I think, are quite well established. As you move off from those things that are very clean signals, things get tougher. Sorry, where am I?
Me? Oh, sorry. This might be a really dumb question, but so I think I understand what you're saying is that when you feed the information into the processor or whatever, you feed in the algorithm and you multiply and you subtract the negative numbers, and so there's this architecture in there that allows, you know, decisions to be made or whatever. But there's a sort of a point at which judgments don't happen anymore, and they happen in 2-year-olds. So would it be possible to let an artificial intelligence partner with a real person to actually, once it has the fundamental architecture, to actually go through a bunch of scenarios and say, yes, do this. No, 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 this person looks mean, don't ever do this. Or, you know, so I was listening to Mark Zuckerberg talk about how difficult it is to teach his computers to distinguish between hate mail and not hate mail, as an example. But it would seem like if you just fed a ton of hate mail in, even as it was changing over time, and said, this is hate mail, this is not, this is hate mail, this is not, it would eventually learn on its own once it had that basic, you know, infrastructure.
So it's a really great question, and the answer is that's how Google built the first generation of spam filters that actually worked well, is they just had people flag things as spam. Every time you flag something as spam, it says this is an exemplar of spam. The thing that's tricky about what Mark Zuckerberg is talking about is that the order of examples they need are millions to billions. This is not, so I have colleagues who work on reconstructing connections in the brain from these small microscope slices. And really what they want to do is realize that it's the same trunk of something that's going up through multiple slices, so it's a bunch of circles, and you have to say, oh, does this circle belong to the thing? And in reality, the best way they do that is they pay undergraduates who are full-time to do it every day, and it's simply not scalable. So that's part of the difficulty. On the other hand, there's a tremendous amount of interest. I mentioned this in response to the last question. Our ability to label things, we just can't scale much anymore. So there's a lot of interest in what's called semi-supervised learning. So supervised learning, that is, we know the right answer, we tell the algorithm, you need to output this. Unsupervised learning is we say, just learn some stuff about the data, and we kind of code in what we think are the kinds of things it should learn about, or what sorts of ways it should use to learn. Semi-supervised says, I've got a small batch of labeled data, and I had a lot of unlabeled data, and how do I make the most of those? So that's on the automated end. The other end that we're really interested in is decision support. So if you talk to anyone who does AI for medicine, and I have a colleague who does this, very few people in that space are really talking about fully automated diagnosis. And there's 2 reasons. One is that doctors are so much better pattern matchers in most things. So this goes back to the previous question. Things that seem likely to be outsourced. Dermatologists on very specific carcinomas can now be beaten by deep neural networks. Very specific kinds of tumors. I have a colleague in radiology at Duke. This is what he does. There are very specific conditions where we have enough labeled data that we can do better than a radiologist. but across the board we can't. And so what you really want to do is offer advice and information to a physician so they know how to make an informed decision. The second part of that is auditing. So there's a lot of interest in the last couple of years in interpretability in machine learning, because as you're feeding the data through, in most models, there's not a stage where the algorithm can explain to you, well, I made this decision because of X and Y and Z. It was because there was a dog in the photo, and there's a clown in the photo, and I thought it was, a birthday party or something. It can't do that. It just outputs an answer for you, and all you get are these sort of murky psychedelic images about what it might be paying attention to. And so for anything where we feel like there is a life or death decision to be made, or a legal decision, or a safety decision, I think most people think that it's going to be necessary to have a human look at that for a while, or at least have code that can be audited. And that's difficult because most of our best models don't work that way right now.
Hey, I really enjoyed your talk. And it was reassuring to hear about all the barriers between us and Skynet. So that was, because constant fear.
Yeah.
But I think we have seen lately that the machine learning algorithms and access to all the data can put a lot of power in the hands of a small group of people. So I was just kind of curious if you have any thoughts on the ethical considerations of applying these sort of things widespread.
So I don't know that I'm any more than a layman on this. One of the things, I think I personally tend to be a little less menaced by it because I understand a little bit how they're doing this, which generally means I know how hard it is to get the algorithms to actually give you useful stuff. They do have tons more data than anything I touch. And I think there are some legitimate concerns there, and largely around the model that they've used to build these companies. We've all kind of opted into this idea that they're selling my attention and my advertising revenue and things like that. The weird thing is that a lot of what's doing that is actually not sophisticated algorithmically. They just have enough data. There's this, I don't know if this is lore, if this is true. So it is a sort of thing that I know that there are large swaths of Amazon and Google and these other companies that are essentially doing click prediction with sparse logistic regression, which is just a bunch of buzzwords, but is essentially a thing that we could teach to freshmen. It's not actually sophisticated algorithmically. There's just enough data to make it work. I'm not sure how true that is these days, but at one point, I'm less worried on the algorithmic end than I think where a lot of people are, which is on the data and privacy end. And I think that's a discussion where we have to talk about values and protections and that sort of thing. And I'm just not much of an expert there.
Hi. So I'm old enough to remember the first AI winter. So, and I kind of worry that some of these training-based approaches are heading for the same kind of dead end. Language translation is kind of the obvious example. There's going to come a point, presumably, where French to English translation by machine is so good that nobody can make a living at it anymore, and everything that the Canadian government does, or the European Union does, or the United Nations does is going to be done by computers, and there's going to be no fresh examples to train language translation on, and then basically you just completely plateau on what French to English translation is, and it's locked in for all time, and new words come along in English and French, and there's no good translations for them because nobody can make a living at it anymore. Much like the lady here was suggesting. Is that a concern? Is that a real fear?
I hadn't thought about that. I'll give you one scenario in which this doesn't happen. In which case, we do English to French translation, and I'm counting on the pride of the French in their language to modify translations. I mean, it's an interesting thing because we're far enough from it now that it's not, we're close, not inconceivable, right, that there are some of these things, and we're far enough from it that, it still looks like this possibility. That one I really don't, I mean, they're constantly, the systems are constantly getting feedback from users to say, and again, even in French, my friend who's Francophone said, that's not the way you would say that. I think it is interesting in some of these other cases where people are more interested, Google is really interested in doing this with their Project Magenta, like music generation and these other things that, we're not necessarily very worried about today, but there are at least classes of low quality creative endeavors that maybe they could do passively with. And maybe you say, oh, that's kind of sad if we're not generating new stuff. I've not thought about it a lot, to be honest, which is probably the sad part. Again, I spend most of my time thinking about how we take the stuff that's working and think about actual brains, that I dip my toes into the actual AI world.
Raise your hand if you got a question. But while Katie gets to the next one, I'm going to ask, where, was that funny? Where is there artificial intelligence and I don't know it? And me being a general sort of public, where's there AI stuff going on in the background of places where I wouldn't necessarily know that there's AI selling me products, influencing decisions, that kind of thing?
There's a substantial amount of it just in the manufacturing sector, which people don't hear about because it's not consumer facing and it's not terribly sexy. But I was touring an auto plant with some colleagues at one point, and we saw a robot, pick up a windshield, actually turn the windshield because the glue spout was fixed, and then stick it on, and it had to do 2 or 3 adjustments, and that's all computer vision stuff, right? And we don't think of that as AI because it's not trying to mimic human intelligence, but in some ways, I'll distinguish 2 things. Some people start talking about the difference between machine learning or pattern recognition and artificial intelligence, which have been somewhat separate and we kind of conflate in this discussion. That sort of falls more under the pattern recognition, machine learning, computer vision. They're not trying to make something intelligent, and yet it's using the same algorithms to do that. And in a lot of cases, just for data analysis in my field. So we're not even talking about modeling the brain, we are just looking at analyzing data. People are replacing things all the time. So in statistics in general, there are places where we just say, oh, we'll just train a neural network to do this thing that we would have done a different way 5 or 10 years ago. It's happening in your cars. If you have a car that parallel parks itself, in a few years, all of our cars are going to auto stop for pedestrians. Those things are going to come first before the driverless stuff because those are very specific tasks, benchmarked, and made very reliable. And so those sorts of things are going to get built in all the time. What are a couple of others? Anything that's going to tweak settings slightly. So, thermostats in homes, you can buy a Nest now that does this, and it takes training data and does it. If you want to buy a crock pot that connects to the internet, that people do. Yeah.
Trying to make connections between a computer and a brain, I can understand where you're looking, but for the human, everything they do is going to be colored by their emotions. It's always going to be colored by their emotions, or heavily weighted by their emotions. For example, an infant learns how to recognize its mother, but maybe the reason it retains it for so long and so strongly is because it associates that face with warmth and with food and the pleasure those things bring. The computer, I don't see how you ever get to the point where the computer can simulate those feelings so that it can lock in those things that are important relative to those things that are not important. Is there anything going on in that area?
There are a few things. So one is that we know a great deal about how sort of mother-infant and to a lesser degree, father-infant bonding works. So I have colleagues who spend a lot of time studying oxytocin and vasopressin and dopamine and these chemicals that we know are instrumental in that. They're not the whole story, but they play a huge role in that. So the neurobiology of that, our understanding is really advancing rapidly, and people are doing really fantastic work on that stuff. And then there are sort of 2 questions. If our goal is to simulate the brain in a computer, and there are groups that do that, then simulating the actions of those molecules is very important. And they're trying to build in as much understanding as we have, which is admittedly incomplete. There's a big debate going on in the machine learning community as to whether they need to care anymore about how the brain does something. They're engineers for the most part. Some are computer scientists or statisticians or whatever. But for those of them who are trying to solve a practical problem, the argument is, well, if we do well enough, I don't care if it works like the brain works. And I think the pendulum is still kind of swinging that direction right now that says, if there's some useful idea we can steal from the way the brain works, let's do it, but let's not rack our brains about whether we're biologically plausible. And so emotion being one of those tricky things to define, even though we all experience it, I certainly can't tell you that we have a way to do it. And I certainly can't tell you that it's necessary. I guess I can tell you at the very lowest levels neurobiologically, our understanding is moving quickly. And at the highest levels experientially, we feel like it's important for certain things. But in the middle, it's tough.
It's interesting to hear some of your explanation for that, because some of what I'm trying to figure out is why you do what you do. And that is, are you trying to understand our brains better, therefore model another brain? Or are you trying to find something to do a better way? I kind of look at artificial intelligence as a way to augment us in doing well what we want to do well, and help us do things that we don't do well.
So I'm a neuroscientist. I'm not. This is my confession now. Whatever, an hour in. I'm not a machine learning researcher. That's not my primary identity. So I care a lot about how the brain works. I think one of the difficulties that we run into in biology in general and neuroscience in particular is there are a lot of trees and not a lot of forest. There are a handful of really central ideas in theoretical neuroscience, but only a handful. And what's been really difficult over the last 70 to 80 years of people thinking quantitatively about the way the brain computes is we understand somewhat at the level of single neurons what goes on, and we can construct very small model networks, but the amount that we don't know is staggering. So what we would like to figure out, at least what a lot of us feel like our goal should be in theoretical neuroscience, is to understand computational principles by which the brain works. So I'll give you two examples. One is that, the outer part of the brain is the cortex, and that is, in most places in the human brain, 6 layers. Those layers have the same organization basically throughout the brain that is shared with a lot of other animals like us. And the neurons come in specific types, and they're arranged in specific ways, and it really seems like that should have a function that we could describe. That seems like the sort of thing that you say, why does having neurons arranged in this repeating pattern across the brain facilitate the kinds of learning and behavior that we do? The other is there is a set of nuclei deep in the brain called the basal ganglia. This is the stuff, in one of my other hats with Parkinson's research, this is what we study because this is what goes awry in Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders. It's a group of nuclei in the brain that are shared with every other animal that has a backbone, and it should probably have a single describable function. We should be able to say the computational function of these areas is to do X. And I think we have a couple of proposals for what X is in that case, but not a lot of ways to connect the dots. Those, I think, are the questions that my group is going at in the larger term. But if we think the answers to those are computational and algorithmic, then we can learn a lot by studying much simpler systems. I have colleagues who work in worms, and I have colleagues who work in mice and rats and monkeys and humans, and the reason they do all of those other species is because we think there are similarities. And for us, working in artificial networks, the similarity there is not in the genes, and it's not in the hardware that the biology is using, it's at the level of algorithms and learning rules and things like that. So that's where we really look at it, is we look at what's going on in the AI community, and we say, are there ways that we can use this to kind of make simplified models and see if we can gain insight to make testable predictions about the brain? And so that's at least where my lab works at, but people kind of go all along the spectrum.
Do you, I've got two, not questions, but comments, and maybe I can get your feedback on. One is that AI has always been, say, a child is much better than AI can't compete with a 2-year-old. But the 2-year-old has one advantage, it has you and your wife. So besides you saying, yes, this is that, yes is that, you're also their model that they can see as daily life. And you don't just have a computer, an AI system sitting around watching people interact and figuring out what life is all about. So that was one comment. The other one is something on a Star Talk today, Neil deGrasse Tyson. They're talking about SETI and stuff, but they started talking about intelligence on Earth. And someone said that dolphins have the second largest brain on Earth and the high level of complexity and intelligence. And he gave a quote, and I think it was by Carl Sagan, saying there's a number of experiences where people have taught dolphins to speak and react to 50 words. But there were no reports of any humans learning any dolphin language, which is sort of what you're trying to do by looking at AI and trying to relate back to the human thing. So if you can make any comments on either of those two, I appreciate it.
So one of the critiques, there's a really nice review paper on this sort of idea of you know, what sort of developing humans do well that AI doesn't, from some colleagues of mine that just came out. And one of the critiques to that paper was, well, kids get like 2 years of training time to do the stuff I talked about today, right? Like they're learning pretty much even while they're asleep, they're generating new nerve cells, and they're doing that all the time, right? For the first year of my daughter's life, she's pretty much just learning to see and stand up straight. And that's all she's doing. And the argument is, well, you know, if we trained our GPUs like for a year, the answer is we wouldn't actually get those models any better. So training time doesn't seem to be the limit, because what happens is after a couple of days of training these models, they don't get any better anymore. They just kind of plateau. And partly it's because we don't build the sort of flexibility in and we don't know how to. The robot I showed you actually does have a demonstrator. The robot is given many, many demonstrations, just not of the specific task. So the robot is given a lot of experience with blocks and blocks moving around, and that's how it kind of manages to do a thing given one example, is it knows a lot about how blocks move that it's managed to learn. So people are trying to incorporate that phenomenon of tutors, and the idea of learning from a tutor. One of the tricks that people use actually is you spend like 2 weeks training a really complicated neural network, and then you use that neural network to train a simpler neural network, which is much smaller and able to go on your phone. So that's another trick that people use. So I think that the learning time differences are there, but the priors that you sort of start with hardwired in still, I think, arguably make a difference. The dolphin thing is kind of interesting for a few reasons, because these things about language come up. I think dolphins are considered to have one of the higher brain masses per unit body weight, which is always how we scale this thing, right? Bigger animals just have bigger brains. As far as I know, and I'm not a linguistics expert, please don't report me to my colleagues, is that what we have not seen definitive evidence from a non-human animal is what's called a novel utterance. That is, you can train an animal to use a vocal cue, like a single word, as a cue. What animals don't do is the sort of Chomskyan regression where they're able to compose those cues in novel ways. And this has been a lot of the debate about what, again, people argue about is or is not language in apes, is that I think the conservative position is that they've been able to use signs but not do language. That was sort of different than your comment, but I think it's interesting science. Yeah, I mean, the only way about the sort of stuff we're doing is to say, well, it's either going to pay out or it's not. You know, we're sort of banking on it, like every lab sort of says, well, I'm going to put my chips on the table, and this is what I think a promising area is. It's also why we work on more than one thing.
You mentioned that you have translations between English and French and English. Obviously, it's a bit easier because they're all Canadians, so they really think the same way. I hate to rain on your parade on that one, but nevertheless, are any of your research going into the real translations and discussions from language to language, from French to British? You know, we have, of course, the world's biggest language disaster called Brexit, which is one of the things that we can use as an example. Any ideas that people may get finally to that point?
I mean, so the language work is not mine. I'm just sort of hitting the highlights of what a lot of other people do. And it's sort of sadly inartistic the way they do it. What they do is they take a giant dictionary, and they have, you know, sort of every word is an index in that dictionary. So it's a number. And then what they do is they compress it down to something that's only got like 20,000 entries. And they do this in kind of a fancy way. This is called the word vector embedding, and they can do fun things like say king minus man equals queen, or you know, they'll do these sort of additions and subtractions. So it's weird because it's a math trick that lets them do it, and that's really what's powered a lot of this. And that the interesting thing about that is that embedding is across all languages. So what it doesn't do well with are things like idioms, right, where you're just not, the semantics of it are totally ignored. And that's the difficult part, right? It's the getting a bad but passable translation is doable. Getting an excellent translation is still, you know, for craftsmen and artists. And so I don't know what the cutting edge there is, so I really can't speak to much more than that. It's just interesting. Again, it's less a, there's very little in it that is specific to language, except insofar as language is just a dictionary of words, which is sort of deflating, but that's how they do it.
Let's give John one more round of applause. Thank you very much. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming out to the Science Cafe tonight here at the museum. Hope you enjoyed tonight's program. I hope that you'll come back every Thursday night and take in the Science Cafe every week, at least every month. If you do it any less than once a month, you're just not learning anything new in your life. So you come here to the Science Cafe, this is where it gets done. Thanks so much, everybody. Travel safe. We'll see you next time here at the Museum of Natural Sciences.